My name is Alissa Harrington, and I am Assistant City Attorney for the City of Northfield. And I am going to be giving the presentation today along with some of the staff from the city. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and hopefully we will pull up the PowerPoint that everyone can see, and we'll be able to move forward from there. So can I get for those of you who haven't used Zoom before, you should have a little option to give me a thumbs up. Can all of you give me a thumbs up if you can see what says Flaherty Hood? Great, thanks, Matt. Excellent, Carrie, Deb and Jess, Jeremy, Chris. Thank you all, that is really helpful. I appreciate that immensely. So I think with that, we're going to get going. Like I said, we are going to be presenting today on the Northfield rental licensing ordinance changes. These changes have been worked on for some time now between the city and our office, the city attorney's office, to try to make some changes that everyone felt would be a good way to do it. So start out with some introductions. As I said before, my name is Alissa Harrington. I am an assistant city attorney. I work for Flaherty and Hood and work with Northfield as well as a number of other cities throughout the state. Melissa Hansen is on. Melissa's waving. She has the City of Northfield logo in her background there in the black with the blue kind of stripy thing. And Melissa is the housing coordinator. So she has been a part of all of this as well and working on housing projects in general. We also have Mike Morehouse, who I'm trying to see if I can see him, if he is on or not, but Mike is the building official. There's Mike, who is, hi Mike. Mike's waving now. Mike is the person who is heading up the building inspectors and other officials. So is the one you'll be working with as rental housing providers when you get to the point of getting a license or needing an inspection. Also on the phone, we have some other staff, Adam Felling, Mitzi Baker, and I believe Christine Jensen. Melissa or Mike, am I missing anyone?
I believe Carrie from our office is also on too. She's our admin.
Excellent. Yes, there she is. There's Carrie. So I think that is kind of the team on our side of the introductions. And so with that, I think we're going to get going, but just a quick note on that as we go through this. If you are able to ask a question or want to ask a question or make a comment, you can go ahead and put that in that chat window that will be sent to either all of us or just to myself or Melissa or Mitzi. And then we would be able to answer those. It might be from any member of the staff though that might be able to answer that. So if you could just include it to everyone, that would be helpful. Furthermore, if you do ask a live question, if you could introduce yourself and let us know who you are, that would be really helpful as well. So with that, we're going to get started. First things first, the agenda. Introduction, we've already gone over. I'll go over quick ground rules. Then we're really going to dive into the meat of the presentation. We're going to talk about why we're doing this, what our goals are, what the proposed changes are, and really they're in 4 different areas. And those 4 different areas include rental licensing, and then these areas that really support the rental licensing program, including an administrative citation process, an abatement process, which together we're calling an enforcement process, and nuisances. There are other supporting pieces then that we want to discuss, and then talk about kind of procedurally where we are in this, what the steps are, what we're doing right now, and then we'll get to questions at the end. So a couple of ground rules as we move forward. This is an attempt to have two-way communication, and so doing so requires some respect and courtesy. I'm going to be presenting information. I'm hoping that you're going to be having comments and or questions and getting those to us through the chat window and or by speaking with us at various times. And there is going to be the possibility of dialogue. If we do have an issue with any kind of respect or anything like that, we'll have to stop that dialogue, and we don't want to do that because that's really why we're here. Sometimes myself or other staff may say we don't know, or we'll have to get back to you on that. And that's an honest answer at this point. Nothing is set in stone yet. This is still in development. It's been in development for over a year, but we still have a couple steps to go here at the end. So given all of that, I'm going to stop after each section for questions. And give you an opportunity to either type some in or to just raise your hand like we did before at the beginning, and hopefully we'll call on you then. Just so you know, the feedback that we're gathering today and in the other feedback sessions we're holding this week is going to the council. They are ultimately the final decision makers. We are not the decision makers, but we have been the ones who've been working on this, which is why we're presenting on it. Finally, if you have something you want to say that you think is better in an email, if you think of something later, if you want to comment on something after the presentation or ask a question, Mitzi Baker is the person who is going to be compiling all of this feedback to go to the council. And so her email is here on this slide, mitzi.baker@ci.northfield.mn.us, and that's who you can contact. So with that, I think we're going to get going. So first off, we're going to start with why are we doing this? So the reason why we're doing these feedback sessions is because you are an important part of this process. This presentation is specifically geared towards people who are rental housing providers or landlords. You are an important part of this process, and we want to make sure that you know that we're trying to include everyone who is in this process, because policies are really better when they get input from those who are directly involved. And on the other side, Mike and Carrie and Melissa and everyone's job is easier when we implement this policy if you have knowledge of what those changes are, when they're coming, and there's a lot of open communication there. So as you know, housing is a community-wide issue. It's something that impacts everyone. For those with philosophy degrees, it's the base level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it's one of those things that needs to be in place for a lot of other things in people's lives to feel settled and safe. And rental housing, by definition, always includes at least two perspectives, right? You have two providers. You have the rental housing providers or landlords on one side and the renters on the other. And so we wanted to make sure that we were getting feedback from everyone and communicating with all of those groups as to what we're looking at and what's going on. So where are we? Where we are now. So right now, the rental housing licensing program in Northfield is a one-size-fits-all model. It looks at one type of license and addresses that to all different types of rental licensing situations. The standards of care that we have in the statute, or in the city ordinance, don't exactly match the problems that we hear most frequently from tenants. There are really limited tools for administration and enforcement, which means that something that is a small problem can sometimes be treated the same as a big problem or just completely ignored. And so we wanted to provide some proportionality there. There are also different standards for rental properties than they are for homeowners, which not only is a fairness issue, but also confuses it if you're talking about renting a single family home or something outside of the idea of a traditional multi-unit apartment building. Finally, there's no standard abatement process. So there is no set way that anyone can say things are going to move forward if there is a problem. And that's an issue for everyone, right? If we don't know what the standards are, if we don't know how things are going to move forward, it's difficult and it's harder for everyone involved. So we went into this process with a set of goals, and we wanted to start with our goals and develop our processes and the new ordinance from there. So the first one was to improve the quality of housing. Now, Northfield has a lot of fabulous housing already, and a couple of bad actors. But we wanted to make sure that there was a way to ensure that where there are problems, that quality of housing is brought up to a minimum standard. We really wanted to provide clear standards and procedures, which is a huge thing, both for the rental housing providers like yourself, and also for the program staff and the renters, to really lay out clearly what is the expectation, what are things that should be brought to the city's attention, what is the standard that you should be using from the beginning, what does the city expect in their inspections. We also, speaking of inspections, wanted to make sure that we were using resources and particularly staff time efficiently. In the past, there has been, again, as we said, with that one size fits all model, it means that staff time might be equally spent on a situation that has no problems and a situation in a housing setting that has a lot of problems. And so we wanted to make sure that there was more time spent on the properties where it needed to be spent, and less time on those where it doesn't need to be spent. We wanted to improve the tools for administration and enforcement, again, as I mentioned before, to make sure that what we had available to the staff was able to be implemented in a proportional way, so that if there's a small problem, there's a small correction. If there's a much larger problem, there can be much larger consequences then. We specifically set a goal of engaging stakeholders, which is part of what we're doing here today. As I said before, we really are moving forward with the idea that it is best to make sure that all of those people who are working in an area on the ground, those who are practitioners in the area, have an opportunity to comment and to provide information so that we have an idea of how things will play out. We did want to shift the focus a little bit to tenants. There are some problematic language pieces in the current ordinance that really make it seem like rental housing is a secondary citizen or a secondary type of housing, and that's pretty discriminatory against tenant occupied housing, and we wanted to remove that. And we wanted to remove outdated provisions, specifically ones around family, about ID requirements and other things. So at this point, I'm going to go into the rental licensing goals specifically. So for rental licensing, as I said, we want clear standards for landlords. We wanted to reward responsible landlords with longer license periods. Establish processes for non-compliant properties of all sorts that is proportional to what is going on. Address some of the common renter issues that we hear that are not currently addressed in the code. Provide accurate reporting procedures, both externally, so tenants and landlords and everyone know how to get information to the city, and also so that the people in the city across all of the different departments know who to go to if there is an issue that runs into the rental licensing ordinance. Again, that efficient staff time, removing dated language. We wanted to provide consistency with other areas of the code as well. So the current code is in Article 3, it's between sections 14.76 and 14.138. So not that big of an area, but it's a lengthy problem in one spot. There's a very problematic purpose statement in the code, as I mentioned, that really treats renters and rental property owners as if they're not going to care as much about their property. And we don't think that's true. And that's really an outdated concept. And so we wanted to remove that. And in this code, though, there are also things that we wanted to remove because they just don't belong in the rental licensing code area. There are zoning provisions, property maintenance code items, just verbatim repetition of building codes, nuisances, hazardous buildings, all of these things that don't really belong in the rental licensing code because they should apply to everyone in Northfield, not just rental housing. As I mentioned, there's really only one type of license. There's the long-term license. The short-term license, kind of put an asterisk by that. That's only applicable in very specific situations. And finally, there aren't really good enforcement mechanisms other than moving to remove the, cancel a rental license. And we really wanted to provide the staff with more intermediate enforcement tools to make sure that there was an appropriate response based on what the problem was. So here are some of the proposed changes to the code. First is a new and shortened purpose statement. Secondly is moving all of those areas that should really be applicable to all of Northfield to their respective places within the code where they belong. Removing redundant or conflicting requirements. We don't need to have a repetition of the building codes. We don't need to have a repetition of what the standards are for property maintenance. Those should all be housed in one place so that there's no question of what those standards are. We have moved from one type of license plus the temporary license to 3 types of licenses plus the temporary licenses. And I'll get to what those are in a little bit. With those license types, if there are properties
in the
that
freezer. It's in the freezer.
more problems, we can require both mitigation and action plans to make sure that either with a mitigation plan, they don't become larger issues, or with an action plan that the problems that are there are addressed in a timely and appropriate manner. We added in items addressing common tenant issues that we have found. Some of those include just changing some of the language. For instance, to talk about issues with infestations, mold, etc., which aren't really things that are in the expertise of the inspectors, but providing a process for those to be addressed as well. We also allowed inspections to be based on complaints. So right now under the city code, you have to meet very specific requirements to make a complaint that leads to an inspection. We removed some of those so that the complaints can be coming from multiple different areas. For instance, if there is a parent, for instance, who is concerned about the living condition of their adult child, they'd be able to make that complaint as well. And we also wanted then on the other side of it for landlords and rental housing providers to provide the ability for you to have a prospective inspection. So basically a time when you could meet with a building official or one of the other inspectors to go over either the property before your inspection or to go over a property you might be looking to purchase or to start renting out, to identify what those issues are going to be or could be in that property before there is a actual inspection record and the ability and the possibility of having fines or other things like that added. So as I said, the idea is to have 3 different types of rental licensing. And this is one of the larger changes overall to what you will actually encounter as rental housing providers. So there'll be 3 types of licenses. A type 1 license is the longest term license, and it's for responsible landlords and rental housing providers who are having minimum problems. They're just going on and doing good business, which is what so many of you are doing. And we wanted to recognize that by lengthening the amount of time between inspections and the length of that license, and therefore reducing the burden of having to get ready for inspections on you and also on performing them on the staff. A type 2 license is going to be a license where there are some compliance issues, but it's not necessarily major or ongoing issues. But they do need to be addressed before they get out of hand. And so this would be where you're getting a more frequent inspection. Your license is going to be for a shorter period of time, and you'll have an action plan in place. And that action plan is meant to be a document that's between you and the building official and the city staff that talks about what steps you're going to take to make sure that those issues don't become major ones. The third is for rental properties that are more problematic, where there are ongoing or major multiple compliance issues. We're talking about health and safety issues here, things that could easily lead to fires or issues with carbon monoxide getting into units or really severe safety issues. This is going to be a much shorter license, and it's going to require a mitigation plan. And that mitigation plan is to make sure, again, much like the action plan, that not only are the current issues addressed, but that there isn't a possibility of them coming back up in the future. And so it's going to be a little more proactive. And then again, we have the temporary permit, which again is only in very, very few circumstances and probably not what any of you are working with now. So this is a chart that kind of goes over in a little more detail exactly what I was just talking about. The type 1 license is going to be 2 years, so twice as long as they are now. No improvement plans. And I will just note by saying this number of units and property or nuisance code violations per unit is something we're still working on to find the right balance. This is our stab at it, but we are going to be doing some digging into the property records to see if this makes sense. So that type 1 license, like I said, is 2 years. The type 2 license will be what all of you more or less are working on as far as timing is 1 year. Then the inspections will be once a year or upon request or as needed as determined by the city. There will be that required action plan to make sure that there aren't going to be continued violations. But it's not as significant as the type 3 license. This type 3 license is really going to be that short-term 6-month time period where the mitigation plan is in place to make sure those more serious nuisances and property code violations are being addressed, and that they're not, and that the circumstances are such that they're not going to continue to reoccur. And then, as I said, the temporary license will remain as it is. So this is a lot of math and a lot of confusion and a lot of different things here. So I have a little bit of an example here of how this might play out. So we have 2 different completely fictional rental housing situations. The first one is Gryffindor Gates. And let's say Gryffindor Gates has 10 units. And during the inspection, they find 15 violations. So you take the 15 violations divided by the 10 units to get the per unit violation number, and it's 1.5. So if we go back and look at the previous slide, you'll see that not more than 1.5, when there's more than 3 units, would be a type 1 license. So those issues would be addressed, and then the license would be issued for 2 years as a type 1 license. Slytherin Stables, on the other hand, has 5 units, so it's smaller. And the inspection finds that there are 10 violations. So that's really 2 violations per unit, which again, if we go back and we have 5, which is more than 3, and we have it's 2, so greater than 1.5, but less than 3, you'd have a 1-year license. And you'd have that action plan to make sure that those types of issues didn't come up again. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to some questions, which I'm sure you have quite a few of. This is going to be, like I said, the main portion of, I'll bring it back up to this one. The main part of it that we want to talk to you about. The other pieces of it are really supporting this and, like I said, providing the enforcement of these code issues, but this will be one of the major ones that we're talking about. So with that, are there any questions? let me see here. Melissa, are you seeing anything in the chat window?
See, it looks like that there's a question. Could you give some examples of major and minor issues, please?
Sure, absolutely. And Leota, thank you for that. I can certainly do that. And Julie Larson, if you could mute your audio, that would be great. We're getting a little bit of feedback on it. Actually, I can do it that, so we've taken care of that. So some of the major and minor issues. So a major issue might be something along the lines of a property where there are holes that are getting into holes from the inside outside of the building, where, as I mentioned before, there are problems with the appliances, the furnaces, water heaters, stoves, whatever it is that really increase the likelihood of there being a fire or of carbon monoxide coming into the unit itself. We're really talking about those things that could massively impact health or safety. Minor things are going to be like a, let's say there's a battery missing from one smoke detector out of 4 in the unit, or if there is a banister or a handrail that needs an extra support added to it. Those would be more of the minor issues that we would be looking to address. Does that, Leota, does that give a good example? Do you have any follow-up from that? Okay, thanks, Leota. So we'll move on then to Matt. Matt says, is there an extended grace period for new owners to make corrective repairs? So Matt, there's, like I said, there are a couple things we're doing for new owners to try to address that issue. One of them is to allow for these prospective inspections, which would be the ability to have an inspector come out and look at it at a change of ownership or some other like a change of ownership or turning a single family home into a multifamily home, those types of things, to really get those inspections worked out and see what those issues are going to be. As far as the corrective repairs and the timeframes, one of the things that I think we're really happy about is that we are leaving quite a bit of flexibility in the code for how often and what types of plans are needed for making those corrective repairs. So if there is a lengthy list of them, it's going to be Mike and the building official team who are going to be working on coming up with exactly what are the timeframes for that and what kind of process is going to be in place to make sure that there is progress being made. And kind of allowing for that. So certainly, and I think this is important, and I realized I didn't state at the beginning, but if it isn't clear, the purpose of all of this and the goal of the rental housing program in general is compliance. The city wants to make sure that there is a high quality level of housing available in the city. They want to make sure that the rental housing that is being used is up to standards so that people are safe and healthy. And they want to make sure from a business perspective that there isn't necessarily one landlord who is not making repairs and undercutting others, right? They want to make sure that everyone is on a level playing field on the business end of being a rental housing provider. And so certainly one of the things we added into the code this time is some flexibility so that as long as there is some progress being made and it's a sufficient amount of progress, that there can be extended periods to make corrective actions. Matt, does that answer your question? Do you have any follow-ups? Okay, well, I'll move on, and Matt, if you come back to something, please let me know. So the next one is from Agnes, I believe, or Grant, who is a property manager, and it talks about if you receive more violations than Type 1 license allows, will there be a time period in which to remedy those items to maintain a Type 1 status? And Grant, that's a really good question. One of the things that we've been looking at, and this is one of those times when I'm going to say I'm not quite sure yet, is saying that, you know, this is the idea of these Type 1 licenses are really to catch, to only provide those inspections every 2 years. So if, again, it's going to depend on exactly what the situation is, but generally speaking, we would hope that those every 2 year inspections, you would be able to have a clean inspection. Obviously, if it's something that's not the landlord or the rental housing provider's issue, for instance, be honest, you know, I think we've all had that tenant or have been that tenant when the smoke alarm starts beeping in the middle of the night that it needs extra battery, just takes the battery out and doesn't replace it. And maybe doesn't tell the landlord about it and just pushes it back in. And so you have no idea that it's missing until there's an inspection. Things like that, we're not going to count against you. Generally speaking, like I said, we really are trying to suggest that you take advantage of having more contact to make sure that that every 2 years everything is set. But if there'll be a specific time period, I'm not sure yet. Mike or Mitzi, do you have any comments on that? And you don't have to. Okay. Mike.
I think it would depend on the severity of the violation or the issue with what we're repairing, if I'm following the question correctly.
Yes. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mike. I believe that answers the question. And Mitzi added in to the chat window, again, kind of just reiterating what I said before, the inspection, you should be checking everything that arrives before the inspector does. Again, we're really, part of what we're going to be doing with the supporting pieces, and this is a good segue into maybe the next area, is that we want to be able to provide you beforehand a list of exactly what the inspectors are going to be checking, because the best way for you to comply with what's happening is for you to know exactly what's going to be checked. So like I said, our hope is going to be that you'll, as landlords and rental housing providers, be able to kind of do a pre-inspection on your own based on that checklist. There any other questions at this point? We'll check the names and then I'll go and check here. So Jeremy says, it looks like we are only building in a penalty and not providing an incentive for the landlords who are maintaining good properties. Our rental license is already 2 years. Is there a consideration to extend it to 3 years for Type 1 properties? Mike, do you want to talk about that? About how the inspections work?
Sure. Currently, there has been some talk regarding a 3 year or an extended period license. Currently, that hasn't been put too far forward. We've stuck with the 2 year incentive for the 2 year licenses. it has been on the table, but we haven't really followed up on that one. Just in the current system that we have now, the 2-year would be the incentivizing license.
Thanks, Mike. The next question is SPH. Can you identify some of the problems that currently exist that have brought this issue up? Sure. So a couple of, and Mitzi wanted to just add to what Mike said, a 3-year might be considered in the future. I think at this point, it's a question of really seeing how this works, and I'll get into a second, but this is going to be phase 1 of, we know that there are going to be things that we need to tweak with this as we move forward, and so that might be one of them. Back to SPH with the problems that currently exist that have brought this issue up. Certainly. So there are a couple things, and let me go back here to the slide to talk about some of the issues and talk about kind of where these goals came from. So one of the things that we have seen and has been a frustration for staff is that there are some properties in town that have not been doing even the most basic of maintenance on their properties. But as you might imagine, it is a tricky situation to balance the need for people to have housing versus the need for them to have good quality housing that meets these standards. So for instance, when we're looking at a property that has holes in the flooring, that has leaks in the ventilation such that CO2 and other pollutants can get into the air, that don't have running toilets, that don't have working shower facilities, some pretty severe things. And the only ways that the current code allows the city to address these are by really canceling that rental housing license. And while certainly it is absolutely appropriate for the city to do so because that isn't working, that's not how someone should be living. It does then leave us the question of, well, what happens to the people who are living there now? Where do they go? We again would much rather have compliance with the rental housing standards than have to try to find new housing for people and just simply condemn the buildings that they're living in. That is a very serious step for the city to take. It is, as I've mentioned to staff before, this is a use of property, and so we are very sensitive to the idea that the government does not want to be in the position to take property or infringe on the way it's being used without a good reason to do so. And so we really wanted to provide more ability to address those issues before it became so severe that we would be looking at cancellation, rather than having to deal with all of the other issues that come from that. One of the other things that we've found is that there are some of the problems that have come up with frequently with rodent infestations, cockroach or ant infestations, mold growth. Those types of things are complaints that we hear on a regular basis that aren't really addressed in the code. So those were areas we wanted to address. Further, when we're talking about the standards and procedures, we want to make sure everyone is on the same page. There should be all of you as rental housing providers and landlords and property managers should know and should have something to reference that in plain language lays out what it is the city expects of you to be providing. You should be able to do those preliminary pre-inspection inspections of your units yourself, so you know what's going on. And you should really be able to to take on, to know what that's going to look like and what the consequences are going to be if something happens. That's outside of that. And right now we didn't feel like that was clear, that we hadn't provided those. And part of that was because of the way the code was written. The code is pretty outdated just in the way that it's put together. And so even for an attorney who specializes in city and municipal ordinances and who spent most of her career writing these types of things, it's still pretty difficult to figure out exactly what's expected of you. So we wanted to do that. So that's another one of the big areas. SPH, does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does answer my question to some extent. One of my concerns would be that in solving a problem that we would lose focus of what the problem is. For example, I think during certain months of the year, any house of any quality could have ants.
Absolutely. That's I'm homeowner myself, and certainly was not surprised when I saw ant traps left by the last owners. It's something that happens, and we're not looking for, this time of year, right? End of November, it starts getting cool out, the ants start coming inside looking for food. That's not necessary. That's not what we're talking about. It's more of the issues where it is a consistent and continuing and very severe problem that's not being addressed. And so I definitely appreciate that feedback, though, SPH. That is certainly a good point of wanting to make sure that there is enough flexibility, which we've tried to also put into the code, that things like that are taken into account. It's one thing if the heat isn't working in July, it's another if it's not working in January. So, that's certainly our intent with this, is to give Mike and his team enough leeway to make good judgment calls while also providing enough standards so that there is a standard and that it can be measured against, and that you all know what is expected of you. But obviously things come up that are outside of that. And our intent was for the code to be able to be flexible enough to handle that.
The other issue, if I might just mention, that if somebody moves into a place that has holes in the flooring,
yeah,
that certainly wouldn't be a surprise that they're living in a house with holes in the flooring. But I can understand the safety issue of a hole in a ventilation for the furnace or something like that. So I think that, it would be good that we would separate the issues that clearly the tenant has bargained for, and the issues that the tenant has not bargained for. I
certainly appreciate that perspective, and it, is something that we are looking at. I think there's also, from the city's perspective, as I mentioned before, there's an economic interest of everyone who has housing in the city to have a base standard so that no one can undercut anyone else. And so that's something else we're considering when we're talking about what those minimum standards are going to be. Anyone else? And Barb, I do see your questions for the end, and we will get to some of those questions, so I'll wait till we get there. Okay. Well, if anything else comes up, please let me know. So let's continue moving on here. To enforcement. So as I mentioned before, the enforcement in the current code really is very heavy-handed, and it kind of gives the enforcement staff a hammer and not many other tools to use. And I'm sure you're all aware of the adage that the only tool you have is a hammer, suddenly everything looks like a nail. And we want to move away from that so that we can really address the issues as they need to be addressed, and in a way that works towards compliance without unduly criminalizing activity or otherwise causing a penalty against the owner or the property. So, and this enforcement section is not just applying to rental housing licensing. I want to make that clear. This is enforcement of the code overall. So for instance, right now, section 1.8, and then with each section basically says a violation of this city ordinance is a misdemeanor payable by up to $1,000 fine or up to 90 days in jail. It's a criminal violation. It has to be charged out by the criminal attorneys for the city and taken to court, which is a lengthy and expensive and process that doesn't really get us towards what we need or what we want, which is the compliance. Many other cities instead use a set of administrative citations, abatement procedures, and processes for internal appeals to do that. And so that's what we have looked to. As before, our goals in doing this is to provide very clear language, process, and procedures, give staff more tools, allow for those different levels of enforcement that are commensurate with what is going on, give some teeth to the rental licensing program so that the issues can be addressed not only with using that, affecting the license itself, but that it can be addressed outside of that. Create a internal process versus the criminal court process. Provide a process that really complements the criminal process, because certainly we, as you'll see as we get to some of these examples, sometimes these are best dealt with in a criminal process. And then provide abatement procedures for when someone is not willing or able to address a nuisance condition or a public health issue themselves. So some of the proposed changes to the code. One, we're taking all of those little spread out, a violation of this code is a misdemeanor provisions, and putting them into one chapter with 3 articles. The criminal penalty remains the same. There is an option for administrative enforcement, which would, in most cases, start with an order to correct, which getting back to one of the questions is kind of that preemptive, hey, there's a problem here, you need to correct it, or there could be more steps taken before there is any issue, any administrative citation or any criminal process taken. There are a couple exceptions to that with things, and we'll get to those, but that's the main idea. Fines and fees, and then an internal appeals process for rental housing licenses, and an abatement process. So hand in hand with this enforcement is really the changes to the nuisance code. So most cities have a nuisance code that talks about what are considered to be public nuisances. So these are things that are considered to be a problem, and that they are actions that are taken by private citizens that need to be addressed by the public authority because they are in some way negatively impacting other citizens or the city. So right now, Northfield doesn't have kind of an overarching nuisance code. Instead, many sections of code contain lists of those nuisances. Criminal violations are the only way to address them. There's no administrative citation. There's no process for appeals. And there's very limited ability to correct the nuisances if the person is unwilling or unable to do so. Really, it only applies to shoveling, mowing, or diseased tree removal. There's also no discussion of enforcement authority. So when these issues arise, it becomes an issue of calling the police, who aren't necessarily in the best place to talk about compliance or how it impacts rental housing or other areas, but rather they have the kind of, they're used to dealing with a criminal process. And so that's how it's dealt with. So the goals here again is really providing that clarity of what's going on, allow the administrative process to work, address some common complaints, designate who is responsible internally for enforcement and who has the best ability to do so and work with people, give staff the authority to investigate clearly, and provide those abatement procedures. So, Sarah, did you have a question?
No, sorry, I just had to change devices.
Oh, that's totally fine. I just wanted to make sure. So the idea with the nuisance code is to recodify it into categories: health, peace and safety, morals and decency, and vehicles. That way, it is clear in which category it falls, what the kind of standard procedures are internally and externally. Everyone in the city, and again, this applies to everyone, not just rental housing, is able to realize what are the things that could cause problems. We are identifying when correction is appropriate versus immediate citation versus immediate abatement. So what would that look like? So for instance, let's say that you have a house and there's been a bunch of garbage that has piled up against the side of the house. You were on vacation a couple weeks, missed garbage day, and it's piling up there. And one of your neighbors is like, hey, there's a large pile of garbage. Something should be done about this, calls the city. The city would come out and look at it and say, oh, well, okay, we're going to send an order to correct that basically says you have a period of time to correct this, or else we will go to a citation process. That's a situation where correction is appropriate. A lot of the property maintenance code issues that we talk about, correction is appropriate. Immediate citations are going to be for things like if there is a issue with one of the things that we talked about was if someone is jumping in a river, if someone is polluting the river, if someone is, I think the classic one of this is if there is, a diseased tree or something like that. And so that would immediately move to citation. Usually those tend to be ones where it's a temporary situation that could cause more permanent damage. So it needs to be addressed pretty quickly. Finally, immediate abatement is the type of actions that the city needs to take care of because it is a pressing safety need. So for instance, if you've left your sidewalk unshoveled for 2 weeks and it's covered in ice, the city just comes in after a period of time and takes care of that. Same thing with if it's a certain type of diseased trees, and those are listed, the city comes in and just removes the tree because it's going to be something that is a direct and immediate threat to health or safety. So really identifying what falls into those categories is something the city code hasn't done up to this point. And so we wanted to make sure we did that. We also have the common complaints not currently covered, providing the broad enforcement authority. So it's not just the police who are going to be enforcing this, and providing an abatement procedure that has due process protections in place to make sure that as those abatement procedures take place, that the people of Northfield have an opportunity and have full due process there. So this is just kind of an idea, again, of what it might look like. You'd have major abatement that would require a city council hearing or an order. We're talking about things that are $10,000 plus. We're talking about entire buildings that have been burned, massive cleanup, hoarding situations, giant problems. And we want to make sure that the city council is involved in that. A standard abatement would be on a staff's order. That would be if you're storing multiple unlicensed cars illegally, if your yard hasn't been cleaned up in 6 months, if there's a need to remove waste, either from a property or from a river or something like that. And so that would be kind of your standard abatement. And then the summary or emergency abatement is staff or council. Again, that's for that immediate threat. That's, again, snow. If there's about to be a collapse of a building or already a partially collapsed building, a public property issue, or if there is, a hazardous vegetation issue. So that's kind of what that's what we're offering for the abatement options here. So with that, the next piece is talking about supporting pieces, but I wanted to take a stop here and see if there were any questions about anything I just said about the enforcement with the administrative citation process, about the abatement process, or about the recodification of the nuisances. And again, feel free to type anything into the window or just raise your hand or say something on the Zoom chat, and I'll respond either way. Otherwise, in a little bit here, I'll be moving on.
Could you just address the question of whether this is specific for rentals only, or are some of these things larger than just the rental issue?
Jeremy, thank you for that. Yes, this is larger than just the rental issue. This is really this is not just the rental licensing program. One of the things we wanted to make sure to do while we were doing this is make it clear that the property maintenance code and these nuisance provisions apply to everyone in Northfield, not just the rental housing, which under the current, there were different standards under the current code, and that we felt wasn't fair. So this is for everyone, and this is outside of the rental licensing program, but it, like I said, gives teeth to the rental licensing program and really addresses, it becomes that enforcement toolbox for issues within the rental licensing program as well. Jeremy, is that does that answer?
Well, it's SPH, but does that, that's okay. Does that specifically then, are we talking about enforcement just for the rental properties?
No, the enforcement is for all properties.
Thank you.
Or all people, because it doesn't necessarily have to be your own property. So one of the things, just to add to that, for example, if, there is some level of responsibility of landlords certainly for these things, but there are also times when, we know that tenants, things happen. And so this is also your tenants can't cause nuisance either in the city. And while you and the tenant both share some responsibility for it, this is a way to help you as well, maybe address some of those issues, or have the city step in and help address some of those severe nuisance conditions that might be caused by your tenants.
Would it seem good that there would be some communication as to tenants that would be on a list that would have caused a problem that would be big enough that they would have caused these kinds of actions to go forward?
I don't know if so I'll just very quickly say that there are a lot of due process considerations when it comes to providing any kind of list of offenders or list of people who might be, forgive the term, but blacklisted from getting housing in Northfield. So that is something that we haven't considered, simply because there are so many legal consequences to it, that unless it is certainly landlords have the ability to use the a trespass list and other trespass actions to keep certain people off of their properties or to not rent to them for various reasons, but doing so outside of a single landlord rental housing provider management system, etc., and having that be a government function is not, I'm not sure if it's even possible, and even if it was, it would be very difficult. So I have a question here from the property manager again, and who's going by Hegnes, I believe. Is there anything that will be new or different in terms of what is being inspected in the standards required of landlords? Anything to highlight? Is it fair to say the change is primarily enforcement? So thank you for that. I think, I don't think we see it as being a huge change in what is going to be inspected and what the standards are. I think what we really see it as is a way to address some of the issues that are not well addressed in the current ones. So for instance, let me go back up here to this one. So we have these issues that are outside of the expertise of the building official and the rental housing license inspectors that certainly do cause issues though for tenants and for everyone else. When we're talking about issues, and we heard this again and again from tenants' rights activists and from the tenants themselves, issues with mold, issues with, again, vast infestation. I'm not talking about, seasonal ants. I'm talking about consistent, continual issues that aren't being addressed at all. Rodents, other vermin, those types of things, and getting into some of the air pollution issues, even as far as how things are, our building official is very good at knowing how things should be vented, but sometimes there are other hazardous things that happen in buildings that they might not be aware of. And so one of the things we've added in the code is ability for the code inspector, if one of these things, if there's evidence presented of it, to require the landlord to seek out a professional opinion. Basically to say what, is this a major problem? Is this something that needs to be addressed, and how would that be addressed? So that's one of the changes. I would say another change is to, as I said before, allow for inspections based on complaints of people who are not the tenants. I mentioned before, one of the reasons for this, and we've had these situations happen recently, is if there's an adult child of someone, and there is a known issue that can be brought forward. And again, sometimes that's not for the because of anything that the landlord did, but often that's how the living conditions can sometimes be a sign of something else going on as far as mental health or with a tenant. And so this again allows another pathway to check on that and to make sure that that is being addressed. The enforcement, I would say, is really the big thing is the change to the 3 types of licensing and the ability to really do targeted enforcement that responds directly to what is needed and what is going on. So to answer your question, I think that's the big thing. The other, as far as the actual what's going to be new or different and the standards, one of, I think, what will be very nice for all of you is having, and this is a good segue into the next section, which is about the supporting pieces, is to have some of these standard documents available for you. So you will know exactly what it is that you will be, that will be during your inspection, what will happen. There will be a publicly available checklist for you. You will be able to see what's going on. You'll be able to know what the standards are up front. And so, hopefully that will be a big help to you and, quite frankly, to the inspectors. I mean, I think we're going under the assumption that most landlords and rental housing providers in Northfield are responsible, that they want to do the right thing, And we want to make sure that the city staff and the rental housing providers and the renters themselves all are in agreement and have a set of standards that is clear and consistent, so that everyone is working off of the same standards. Other standard documents that we're going to be creating and have created, including a standard order to correct, which means that not when you get an order to correct, say, and this is again, anyone, not just in the rental licensing program, but if there is an issue, you will get a document and be able to say and point out, this is the code that has been violated. This is what the code requires. This is what we're requiring you to do by this date. These are your rights. And this is what will happen if you don't correct it in that time. And this is the person you need to contact at City Hall to talk about it if there's some other things going on, some other circumstances we're not aware of. And so I think that is a really good piece. Same thing with the administrative citations and the notices in general. Standardizing all those pieces mean that they're going to be there. Everyone will know what's going on. As part of that, we'll be having those resources available for the website and translation. There'll be decision flowcharts for staff, and there'll be some standard operating procedures, again, so that everybody knows what is going on and what the next steps are. So speaking of the next steps, just quickly go over this and get to these. We're doing the review with stakeholders right now. There'll be some staff team review of the final drafts based on the input. The tools and staff will be prepared for implementation. So especially for, I believe it was, let's see here, Dorothy, who asked if we have enough inspectors to support it. One of the things we're doing is to make sure that hopefully by having those inspections once every 2 years, and not anymore, and during certain months of the year, that it'll open up time for that. Then we'll go through with passage and implementation, and then phase 2. And this goes to some of the questions that I believe, let's see here, Barb asked. First, the extended license who have been active but are not renting out the unit for long periods of time. That's a really good question. I think that's something we need to consider and we'll talk about. Is this city considering changing the density or units per block? So as you'll see, this is a phase 2 issue. We didn't want to get into it in phase 1 because it is such a big issue on its own. Same thing for the Airbnb and the other temporary rentals. And then finally, the code cleanup based on experience. So the 3-year possibility, other things like that, we really wanted to make sure that we got a little bit of time under our belt with what's going on to make sure that everything is working out well. I believe we can email this presentation out if there is a, I had sent Mitzi's email in it earlier, and I believe we will either post this or send it out. And then junk houses, that is related, Ruth, to garbage and other nuisances. So that is a, it tends to be a hoarding situation. Well, I think we're going to time out here pretty quickly on our time, but I want to thank you all for your time today, for your really good questions and comments. I appreciate it. I know that the staff appreciates all of your comments and questions and being engaged in this process. And as we go forward, if you have more comments or questions, please do reach out and send it to the people who are, send it to Mitzi, and we will make sure to talk about it. So with that, I think we're going to sign off. And again, thank you for your time, and hopefully we will see you soon. Thanks, everyone.